Player. And
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, a Labour candidate's been suspended by the party after betting that he'd lose in the general election. The Gambling Commission started an investigation into Kevin Craig, but says it's a separate case to the ongoing election betting investigation. The Conservatives have withdrawn support for two of its candidates who are being investigated. Conservative candidate David Davis told LBC the PM was right not to sack them immediately.
I've looked back over even recent years and seen 8 members of Parliament who had allegations made against them which were subsequently disproven, all of whose careers were pretty much wrecked because people assumed guilt on the first day. And I think it was the right thing to do. Take a little bit of time, make sure that they were right about their judgment.
And Conservative Senate member Russell George is the latest party figure to be investigated for allegedly placing a suspicious bet on the general election date. 4 men have been arrested at the Prime Minister's constituency home in North Yorkshire on suspicion of aggravated trespass. The men are in custody for questioning. At least 10 people are reported to have been shot dead in Kenya following protests. They were demonstrating outside the country's parliament in Nairobi. And 2 protesters had been found not guilty of criminal damage after orange powder was thrown over Twickenham's rugby pitch last year. Prosecutors say they'll accept the jury's decision. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed down 34 points at 82.48. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.18. LBC weather showers easing in the north, dry and clear elsewhere, and a low of 8 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. 2 minutes past 8. It's Tuesday's Cross Question on LBC. With me on the panel to my left, Baroness Nicky Morgan, Conservative peer. To her left, Daniel Kebede, General Secretary of the National Education Union. To my right, Baroness Natalie Bennett, Green Party peer and former leader. And Henry Hill is next to her, Acting Editor of ConservativeHome. They are here to take your questions. You can submit them in a number of ways. As you know, we prefer phone calls and texts. 0345 6060 973. You can also WhatsApp on that number now, and you can text us on 84850. And of course, if you'd like to watch us, and why wouldn't you, you can do so on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's start with a text from Julian in Bromley, who wants to know, how damaging are these election bets for trust in politics? What does whoever's in power at the end of the next week have to do to fix that? Nicky Morgan, let's start with you. These bets are, well, so far, all from the Conservative Party, though there is a Labour candidate who's been suspended today, but not for the same kind of bet. Does it just sort of reinforce this view of people that, well, they're all the same, they're all in it together and they're all willing to make money out of politics?
Well, I think what it does undermine people's confidence in politics more broadly. I think what it also does is damage the standing of those candidates across all parties who have done absolutely nothing like this at all, wouldn't even entertain it. And I don't think that's good for anybody. You haven't mentioned the police officers, because I think that is a relevant fact as well, although, of course, they're not candidates in this election. But I think the whole principle where somebody has information that other people are not privy to and then they use it, allegedly to get a financial gain, is something that people outside politics would struggle to understand. And actually, if they were to do it in their own workplace, there would be serious and almost immediate consequences. And I think that's what people really don't like, is that if this happened to me, I would be dealt with swiftly. So, why do those? Why is action not taken in that same way? And the point, and second half of the question, what do you need to do? I think there needs to be a real focus on culture and politics. I mean, we've ended up this last Parliament with how many independent MPs? 35. Something like that, for various reasons, where people have lost whips and all the rest of it. That is not good. I believe in...
It's 5%, isn't it?
Well, your maths is I'm not going to do live. I'm not doing maths on live radio because I've come a copper on that before.
The head of the teachers union.
You're very welcome. Please come in and correct my. But I just think more broadly, it's one of those things that actually, where people are having to stand down, lose whips, all the rest of it. It's not great. It's not what people want from their politicians and politics.
Henry Hill from ConservativeHome. How have your readers reacted to all of this?
I mean, it's hard to sum up how angry Conservative activists are, because they were already angry with Rishi Sunak because he ambushed them with a general election which the party had not prepared for. CCHQ wasn't ready. There were over 100 candidates not in place. Then they have been out, lots of these people giving up their summer evenings, weekends, trying to return Conservative candidates. And all of that is just completely undermined time and time again by the centre. First with just policies like national service, which no one had trailed. They had no talking points. They had to answer questions from angry voters about whether or not their 18-year-old was going to be sent off to war. They hadn't been briefed, and the answer was no. And now they've had people in positions of privilege in the Conservative Party, yes, a couple of candidates, but also really senior people in CCHQ, the Conservative campaign headquarters, who have just been betting on apparently using privileged information to make a little bit of money, some small bets on the result. It's tawdry. And the worst thing is that at this point in the campaign, the one silver lining for the Conservatives is that with Labour more than 20 points ahead with less than 2 weeks to go, it sort of should be getting a bit easier just organically, because the press naturally start to focus more on what Labour are going to do in office. Nigel Farage peaked too early and his party is withering under the scrutiny that they're getting. And yet the Conservatives have managed... I think so. We've had 40 of their candidates are Facebook friends with the leader of the capital F British Fascist Party. We've had all this stuff about Russia. But the Conservatives have managed to wrest the spotlight back onto themselves for over a week with the tawdriest of scandals. So ConservativeHome readers, activists up and down the country, absolutely spitting venom about this story.
Natalie.
Well, I think actually it's important to look a bit broader than this. And Nicky made reference to the Labour MP, or would-be MP, Kevin Craig, who's had the Labour support withdrawn. And he is a lobbyist, runs a lobbying firm, is responsible for Responsible Gambling Week, which is responsible for promoting safer gambling. And Autonomy, the think tank, a couple of months ago, put out a report highlighting that gambling, compared to its size of the UK economy, puts massive amount of money into UK politics. So I think the issues of trust that Nicky raised, I think what we should be doing is that, let's get the big gambling money out of politics. Gambling is an industry out of control, causing huge damage to individuals and communities. The pervasiveness of it in politics is reflecting across our society. I mean, the Gambling Commission is going to come out with a report next month, and the government leaked the figures on this. 1.3 million problem gamblers in the UK and 6 million people at risk of becoming problem gamblers. So I think we need to look at culture of politics, absolutely, but we also need to look much more broadly and say, how is gambling utterly every part of our society it's penetrated, and what either party could do. I'd suggest I'll offer this free to every party. Let's say you won't take any money from gambling companies. That would be something that would draw a line under this.
I mean, I'm not the Conservative Party. So.
Would it?
Well, I think it would draw...
It's an easy thing to say. Gambling is not illegal, and therefore gambling companies will always exist, unless you think that the companies themselves should be made illegal. But that would be quite a leap. And I'm not sure you could just single out a group in a particular sector to say, well, we'll ban donations from them. I'm sure you'd love to ban donations from fossil fuel companies. I'm sure there's lots of people that you'd like to ban donations from.
I put down an amendment to the Elections Bill Now Act that would have said nobody can donate more than £1,000. No company or organisation or individual can donate more than £1,000 a year across the board. That's what I'd like to do. Let's get all the big
donations are much more than that.
Well, we have to operate in the system we have now. We stand in first past the post elections, although we don't believe in first past the post elections. That's the system we have now.
It would give British politics a very student union election feel if everyone could. If you cap donations at £1,000, right? It would just be people printing out A4 posters and putting them up around their sort of house.
European countries have very tight limits on donations. They don't have student union politics.
So they have large amounts of public money for political parties. Oh, okay. So that's the corollary, is that taxpayers' money would have to go to funding.
We get the politics the few people pay for. What we need is a politics that serves everybody.
The state pays for.
Right, let's hear from Daniel.
So there is an all-time low in terms of trust in politicians, which is highly problematic. But I've got to say, I think this election really was sealed at Partygate. There has been a fair few nails go into the Conservative Party coffin. Whether this is the final one, we are yet to see. But I've got to be really honest. You're right, gambling's not illegal, but cheating is. And this smacks of insider trading. You know, these politicians, in my view, have been carrying on like city boy spivs, engaging in insider trading. It doesn't do anything to restore any faith in politics. And I think actually the Conservative Party are going to be lucky to salvage a Conservative Party at all on the 5th of July.
It is insider trading. I completely agree with you. And it's why I've always said I would never bet on politics, because I hear things, I'm sure, Nicky, you hear things, absolutely. And you think, well, that gives us an unfair advantage in a betting market, so you just don't do it.
Well, that's the point I wanted to make, because I think Natalie, I understand why, but sort of brought it to a bigger issue of gambling in politics and money and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, this is about individuals making a choice to behave or not to behave in accordance with, in this case, the law, when they had access to information. And each day, all of us be given, opportunities to make a decision to go one way or the other. And actually, particularly in politics, I'm afraid you are held to a higher standard. And therefore, you have to, if you have access to that information, you have to decide what is not appropriate for you to do with it. And same with lots of other scandals in politics where people have made really poor individual decisions, and that is a big problem. And I think that is a bigger question about who it is who is stepping forward across the parties to stand as candidates.
Do you think it was fair for Keir Starmer, though, to suspend Kevin Craig today? And I'll declare an interest here. He's been on this programme before. I know him. Seems a thoroughly decent man. And, he's issued a statement tonight saying, look, I did have it. He was betting against himself. He was betting that he would lose, which in a constituency which has a 23,000 majority, it would have to be a pretty catastrophic night for the Conservatives for that to go. But I suspect he now thinks he might have stood a chance. And now being suspended, that may have ruined it. I understand why Keir Starmer did what he did, but did he act too quickly, do you think, Daniel?
I think it's a question for Keir Starmer. He's certainly not been afraid of suspending the whip from politicians and support for people in his party. It's a question for him, really. I'm not overly concerned about the internal politics of the Labour Party, more concerned about actually what they're going to deliver on the 5th of July, because obviously this election looks like it's a dead cert for him now.
Well, we might get some questions on whether it is a dead cert. I have to say, these MRP polls that keep coming out, I'm thinking that they're all the same methodology. How can they be so divergent in terms of what they're predicting? And I wonder whether we're all being led up the garden path. And even if Labour did get a majority of, say, 80, which in any normal election would be considered a bit of a landslide, on election night, I suspect a lot of people would say, Labour have underperformed because they should have had a 200 majority. I wonder if that's going to be part of the post-election narrative.
Masterful expectation management by Rishi Sunak. If Labour came out of this election with a majority only as big as the one that Boris Johnson won in 2019, he'd look like hero of the rearguard, Marshal Ney getting troops out of Russia, that kind of level of genius. The thing about MRP polls, right, is that what makes an MRP poll different is that instead of just applying the national swing, they actually try and calculate the result in any given seat. But that still depends on the assumptions that go into the model. So all of those pollsters producing wildly different outcomes, their models will be based on different assumptions about how people vote. And I think it is useful because after 2017, when YouGov had the first MRP poll, and it nailed it, sort of this slight mythology built up around MRPs. I've had people trying to sell me stories being like, but it's an MRP poll, as if that means like magic real poll. But actually, they are still just only as good as the people and the assumptions that go into them.
And what proves what you've just said is, I think, was it yesterday or the day before, there were 3 polls, 2 of them, YouGov had done the polling data before the MRP thing kicked in, and done by the same company. The Conservatives were on 18% in one poll and 25% on another. It does not make sense.
Yeah, right, but the thing is, to an extent, voodoo. But it provides us with an awful lot of stuff to write about, which is why we keep covering them, and that's why they keep producing them, if we're honest, right? Most polling companies, their political polls don't make money. They use it because it gets written up a lot, and that means that next time Tesco is trying to work out who to A/B test cereal packets, they think, oh, YouGov or whoever. So that's what happens, and that's why we write about them. It's interesting in that we're always fine-tuning, but the other problem is that pollsters always tend to correct for the last set of mistakes. And we've seen this time and again, that the election, in the aftermath of an election, people will say, we would have got it right if only we'd done this. And then they do that, and that's wrong again, because every election's its own beast. So,
well, I'll tell you what, I would not want to be Sir John Curtis on election night doing the exit poll, I have to say, but there we are. Right, more of your questions in just a few moments' time. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Price. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
17 minutes past 8, we have Daniel Kebede with us from the National Education Union. You haven't been in the job very long. Is it what you thought it would be?
How would I describe it? I'd say no regrets, obviously.
Well, that's good. That's good.
Definitely say no regrets. I mean, our schools are facing really tough challenges after 14 years of cuts, and I'm very pleased to be sat with Nicky, a former Education Secretary. But, you know, the incoming government really does need to invest in children. The profession's morale is at an all-time low. So that, of course, creates great challenges for us.
Well, I hope we're going to get a question on education, because we've got the two of you here. I'm sure you two will have your views as well. So if you'd like to ask a question on any aspect of education, you'll probably get on. Right, did I introduce everyone else then? I don't think I did. Natalie Bennett, Green Party peer, and Henry Hill, acting editor of ConservativeHome. Now, here's a really good question from Robert in Catford. Robert, hi.
Hi.
Good
evening, panel.
Hello.
Hello.
Good evening, panel. The release of Julian Assange, is he a criminal or a journalistic hero, or somewhere mysteriously in between the two?
You've given them a get out there. Okay, I think that's a very interesting question. Now, the WikiLeaks founder has spent the last 5 years in Belmarsh Prison in southeast London, but has now agreed to do a deal with the US government, which will see him plead guilty to one count of conspiracy to obtain and disclose classified documents from the US Department of Defense. And in return, he'll be free to go, having spent those 5 years in prison in this country. He's currently flying to the Northern Mariana Islands, no, me neither, an American territory in the west of the Pacific Ocean, to appear in court and make this plea. He's then expected to return to Australia, where he was born. Natalie Bennett, let's come to you first, given that he's a compatriot of yours.
Well, I would also perhaps should declare an interest in that I was actually working for The Guardian when a lot of the WikiLeaks material was actually published. And I note that Alan Rusbridge, who was the Guardian editor at the time, has come out and reasserted, and I would very much agree with my former boss, about the duty to publish, the fact that we actually need information coming out available. Julian Assange Assange is a character who's done many different things. I don't think we should really be focusing on the individual character. I think one of the things that's really important about this is, yes, he's not facing any more jail time, but just the fact that he's been forced to plead guilty to this charge is going to have a really chilling effect on future investigative journalism. This is under the Espionage Act in the US. There's going to be a real impact. And, I spent a lot of time, we were talking before about the media bill. I spent quite a lot of time there, trying to get action against SLAPs, strategic lawsuits against public participation. There's a huge amount of so much being done to chill media action that's exposing things that should be exposed, and that's a real cause for concern.
Do you consider Julian Assange to be a journalist?
Well, he produced material that journalists used at a great extent. So I think, he's a source. I would say, no, I wouldn't consider him a journalist. He's a source.
Because what wasn't the big issue here was that I think WikiLeaks, when it first started, was considered by many people across the political spectrum to be actually a force for good. And then he started releasing information, lock, stock and barrel, with no editing at all, and putting people in danger. And that's where I think, a lot of people drew a line with him there.
And there are also other issues with his personal conduct, and that's why I think I think the important thing really is to focus on the broader issues here rather than one individual, because there are really big global US, UK issues around freedom of the press and about information that's available being able to come out without the fear of lawsuits, either from governments or indeed lawsuits from very, very rich individuals who can put an incredible pressure and have been putting incredible pressure on journalists doing their job, doing the right thing, acting in the public interest.
Did you ever meet him?
No.
Henry?
So I agree with Jenny on SLAP, especially by private individuals. I think that's a real problem in this country. But the state has the right in certain circumstances to take secrets, and I think a slam dunk case of that is when you're dealing with vulnerable intelligence assets overseas whose lives would be put in danger. And that's what he did. He leaked that information, which compromised put those individuals at risk, and also compromised our efforts to surveil and keep tabs on some of the world's most dangerous regimes. So I think it was entirely right to go after him. Obviously, that was not all of the reasons that the law went after him, but I take a fairly fire-breathing view on people who leak state secrets of this sort. I would have very much supported the United States putting him in prison, but at least the process is resolved.
Daniel?
So journalism is about the pursuit of truth. I think we all recognise that. I feel deeply uncomfortable that a man has spent 5 years in Belmarsh prison on 23-hour lockdown for 5 years without a trial. I think that should make us all feel very uncomfortable. And I'm not entirely sure what his crimes were.
Well, he jumped bail, didn't he, for a start?
In terms of exposing war crimes, or what could be construed as war crimes. And of course, those who were involved in those weren't also equally pursued. I think none of us should feel comfortable the idea that someone has been in Belmarsh for 5 years without a trial.
Nicky?
Well, I think for the reasons already stated, on the strict interpretation, he is now, if he's going to plead guilty to this, he is going to be a criminal. And I think there is an absolutely very important place for investigative journalism, and I think your description of journalism about pursuing the truth is totally right, but I don't think that's what he was doing here, and I think he did put people's lives in danger, and I'm just extremely pleased that he's no longer the UK's problem. He's not sitting in a UK prison, and I think that probably the Australian Prime Minister was right today, which is whatever you think about this, it has gone on for far too long, and I'm glad that a conclusion has been, or is about to be, achieved, and he's back home in his home country.
I mean, to me, he had a certain messiah complex that whatever he did, he could justify as being in the wider public interest. But a lot of other people found that quite difficult to justify. And you say, well, let's not look at the individual, look at it wide. I think you have to look at it as an individual as well.
Well, I think the question is about the individual, and there is an answer to that, and indeed, Nicky gave it. That's the technical answer to it. But I think it's really important that we think about going. I'm always looking forward, what's happening, and I know, as a former newspaper editor, I used to be editor of the Guardian Weekly, and I just know how much pressure people in similar roles now are actually under more and more pressure. And that's deeply concerning, because that's an essential part of, what democracy we have is for wealthy people and powerful people for their actions to be exposed. And that's just become more and more and more difficult for the media at a time when lots of media, doesn't have the same resources that it might have had 10 or 20 years ago.
OK. Let's move on to a text question from Annika in Leicestershire. What can be done to make new parents get their kids vaccinated again? Now, officials from the UK Health Security Agency say 1 in every 6 children aged under 5 have not been given the vaccine intended to protect against illness, including whooping cough, polio and tetanus. This is some 10% shy of the target the World Health Organization sets for the number of under 5s vaccinated, and means there would now not be enough immunity among the child population to prevent outbreaks. Now, that's incredibly serious, isn't it? Because, people of our age, I am slightly older than you, Nicky, I will admit that. But I think most parents, it was just a matter of course. Of course their children would be vaccinated. But after the pandemic, the figures have reduced dramatically. So what's the answer to the question? What can be done to make new parents get their kids vaccinated again?
I'm going to say it's a strict answer to the question. My son is now 16 and a half, but speaking from, when I remember what it was like to be a new parent, is to have a very trusted source of information, whether that's a GP or a health visitor or somebody else who is explaining the statistics and why your child is at risk. And I have a feeling, I haven't got the numbers with me, but I think there have been more child deaths related to whooping cough recently.
6, I believe.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
And it's a very serious condition, and it does, unfortunately, can kill very small children before they've had a chance to be inoculated. I think the broader issue is twofold. One is who is delivering those messages, perhaps on a broader national stage. Chief medical officer would be the obvious person. Are they trusted? Why would they not be trusted? Because I'm afraid of the conspiracy theories proliferating online, and the fact that actually people seem to prefer to believe what utter rubbish they might read online about, dangers and vaccination and everything else, rather than actually believing in a trusted health professional. And that's obviously incredibly worrying.
Daniel?
So I think we obviously need to take a public health approach, but obviously so much of the support that used to exist around young families has been completely eroded. Sure Start, for example, decimated, where parents of young children could come and access local services, be informed about vaccines and what is necessary to bring up their young children. I think we need to move away from blaming parents around the lack of vaccination and actually look at the lack of provision and government support around young families.
But in the end, it's the parents who made the decision. So, surely, if this happens, the blame has got to lie there. Now, it may be that they're not investigating things properly. I don't know. Are they doing it out of ignorance? Are they doing it because they've heard all the sort of different stories about COVID vaccines and all the rest of it? I don't know.
How do they get access to that knowledge? How do they get access to that support?
GPs and health visitors, which new parents absolutely do get that support, and they will have that engagement, but they may be choosing not to believe what they are being told. And I'm afraid, Sure Start, it's something the Labour Party go on about. The Conservative Party is talking about introducing family hubs and everything else. But there have been many, many parents for whom Sure Start would never have been an option. They wouldn't have known about it. It wouldn't have been them, wouldn't be the thing. So that's not the answer. The answer is actually giving people really good information, and people are absolutely having that advice, that red book where your child is measured and their progress and everything else.
Natalie.
Well, I think Daniel's absolutely right in terms of the support. The network is just not around families of young children anymore. But I think it's not just also the immediate support network. It's also the fact that so many people are struggling with inadequate housing, struggling with poverty.
That doesn't prevent people from getting their children vaccinated.
Well, but where is the vaccination available? Is it immediately available in a place. And, what happens if you've just been, let's say you're a single parent who's just been moved from London to Wigan, away from all of your support networks. You're struggling to just, get your child fed, bathed, looked after, trying to put food on the table. You're struggling with everything. This is one more thing that may just fall through the cracks. I mean, I've got no doubt there is a problem with, misinformation, conspiracy theories, etc. But there is also a problem with people who are simply struggling to cope and not getting the support that they need, as Daniel said, but also not having the resources around them, that daily life is such an enormous struggle that they're not being able to do all the things that they need to do and that they may well want to do.
I'd have thought look, I'm not a parent, but I'd have thought one of the basics of being a parent was to investigate vaccines and know what you needed to do and when. Surely parental responsibility has to play a part here too.
But I think, where do you start? The first responsibility is to keep the baby clothed, fed, clean, etc. If those things are an enormous struggle and you haven't got enough resources and you haven't, you're going to the food bank to get nappies, you're struggling all the way along the line, then this is just one more thing that people may not be able to manage.
Henry?
Make it mandatory and just have the state take the initiative and do it.
Wow.
I
would never expected.
This is a man full of surprises.
I can be fairly libertarian on all kinds of issues, but those are issues about somebody making a decision about their own life and body, right? But that's not what vaccination is. One, you have a duty of care towards a child. It can't make decisions for itself, and I think that actually getting a child vaccinated is part of the duty of care. And two, as you say, if vaccination falls below a certain level, then there is no longer widespread immunity, and that means that other children, even children that have been vaccinated, you can get really nasty diseases that we have killed off back in the population, killing other people who've done the right thing. So, no, ultimately it is, more support is nice, and making sure that people have more information, because there will be people who are genuinely making mistakes or who are struggling, but there are also people who will be buying conspiracy theories or who have cultural objections, and I think that you draw the line at sort of permitting that and making room for that when it is allowing really horrible diseases to kill children.
But what's the consequence for parents who wouldn't engage?
You do it. I would simply have it done in school, potentially.
Right.
Or if they
without the parents even being consulted.
No, they'd be told. I wouldn't know. But if I had to come up with a criminal sanction for not doing it, I might actually do that, because otherwise you're going to have things like whooping cough, smallpox, not smallpox, but what's the
Natalie,
measles?
Would you agree with that?
Absolutely not. No, I think, the problem is in all kind of ways failure of state provision and failure of the state. The answer is to fix those problems.
But Phil has texted in saying, I'm a parent of a 1-year-old. There is a lot of support out there. Midwives, social workers, breastfeeding support groups, GP. Never at any point did we feel there wasn't support. Well, I suspect that depends on the area that you live in, possibly, and that it's not sort of universal across the country. But fascinating issue. Would you support mandatory vaccination?
No, I wouldn't.
Daniel?
Absolutely not. Support and encouragement, education.
I thought you might be agreeing with him.
Oh, no, that's far too authoritarian an approach for me, really.
How many kids would need to die of whooping cough to change your mind?
I think that could be avoided with, short centres.
You're never going to get 100% inoculation. That was one of the things we learned through.
But you could get
COVID.
it above the level that gives you herd immunity,
and you can have specific campaigns and support and everything else to do it. But I think to make it mandatory, and also, I just think the government's got plenty of other things to be doing, rather than the debate we had all about fines and everything else. So
the government's going to have to do something. The basis of this entire discussion is that the government is doing something. Sort of option one is hosing money at lots of other things.
You've given me a great idea for a phone-in on a light news day, Henry. So thank you for that. We'll come to more of your calls in a moment. It's 8:33. Let's get the news headlines on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
Another Conservative is under investigation over alleged election bets. Russell George, a member of the Senate, has stepped back from the Welsh Shadow Cabinet as he faces an investigation over alleged bets on the timing of the general election. Under a separate investigation, Labour candidate Kevin Craig has been suspended by the party after betting that he'd lose in the general election. 4 men have been arrested on suspicion of aggravated trespass at the Prime Minister's home in North Yorkshire. Officers say a group was escorted off the grounds in Kirby Sigston just before 1 o'clock this afternoon. And at least 10 people are reported to have been shot dead in Kenya following protests over a controversial tax bill. They were demonstrating outside the country's Parliament building in the capital, Nairobi. LBC weather: showers easing in the north tonight, dry and clear elsewhere, and a low of 8 degrees.
Britain decides. Follow the general election and have your say only with LB. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Daniel Kebede, Nicky Morgan, Natalie Bennett and Henry Hill with us taking your calls. And here's Munesh in Southall with another one. Munesh, hi.
Hello, Ian. And thank you very much for having two education specialists on the panel today. I really welcome that, and hopefully we can get to the bottom of some resolutions. And, it's the same thing when it happens with independent schools losing their charitable status. What will happen to the charitable stuff that they're doing? Like, for example, the free tennis lessons or subsidized tennis lessons, the free swimming lessons, to the normal state sector. How will the state sector react to that when they lose all these privileges when this is going on? And, more importantly, what happens if a school closes down, which many of them have threatened to do so? How will that impact the one local economy? How are you going to house all these thousands of students in one local area if this happens?
Well, let's go to Daniel first. You head up the biggest teaching union. I imagine that this is a policy that gives you maybe a little bit of conflict in some ways, because there are inevitably going to be, whatever Labour say, there's bound to be some negative consequences from this, no matter how hard they sell it. Would you agree with that?
So we have to firstly recognise that school fees have risen significantly over the last decade. However, I will absolutely be clear that any employer that seeks to erode the terms and conditions of teachers and support staff that work within those schools using the VAT policy as an excuse will be met fiercely with sustained strike action. We absolutely don't think that the cost of that should be borne onto the hardworking professionals that work within them. However, the caller was saying that state schools can't cope with any extra students. That isn't true. Actually, there is a declining birth rate at the moment. We are expecting 500,000 fewer pupils in our classrooms in the state sector by 2030. So it is, of course, absolutely a difficult policy for those smaller schools to navigate. But, we will not be accepting any erosion of terms and conditions during that.
But it's interesting that you immediately jumped to strike action as your first threat here?
I mean, the way that they would look to save money is around holding back pay and removing teachers.
Well, Military's suggesting that they might sort of stop any free swimming lessons for state school kids to come in to use their facilities, things like that.
Well, I think what we actually do want to see is, we've had lots of swimming pools closed through local authorities over the last 14 years. We want to see, proper investment in communities to ensure that those resources are available.
Okay. Henry?
I think one of the really unfortunate things about this policy is that you, as the caller identifies, if you remove the option of charitable status for private schools, now I hold my hands up, I didn't go to one, but I support private schools in principle. I think that it's all right to have them. Is that you remove a carrot that you can use to encourage them to support state schools and to engage in the community, because half of private schools are not charities already. They're fully private, which means they don't have to do any of that stuff. They are able to make a profit. And you had the other half, which had charitable status, which means they couldn't make a profit. They were able to not charge VAT. And in consequence, the government could attach strings to charitable status. And that included partnerships and support with nearby state schools. And I think it's unfortunate that if Labour implement this policy, we're going to lose that. Now, obviously, any reduction in the private sector, maybe not in pure capacity terms, but in financial terms is a bit of a challenge, right? Because currently their parents pay all their taxes but then don't get the per pupil money back if their pupils were being state educated. They'll increase pressure in areas where basically the state system currently selects by house price. So they will sort of fight their way into areas near the good state schools, or where I grew up, places like Bucks that still have grammars and so on, which will only increase pressure on those places further. I think it is deeply unfortunate. The ironic thing about the skyrocketing fees, actually, is that was an antitrust decision, because until a couple of decades ago, there was a sort of tacit agreement between a lot of the leading private schools to hold fees down.
Oh, I thought you said antitrust.
Antitrust. Antitrust. I mean, it might be the American term, but actually there was a kind of tacit agreement to hold fees down. And then the regulator came in and said they weren't allowed to do it. And that's when the fees really started skyrocketing. So I think this is a misguided policy.
If you were Education Secretary now, how would you be responding to this?
To the proposal?
To the proposals.
Well, the question that I've asked is, this is apparently a policy that's going to raise £1.6 billion. And there is, I'm staggered to hear what Daniel said. I don't think there is any way, certainly in parts of the country, that the state system will be able to cope with the children who will not be going to independent schools and who will be accessing the state system. So I think it's a policy that doesn't add up, literally, in terms of finances, which you could say is symptomatic of a wider question about how Labour sums are adding up.
You could if you were being party political.
I could if I'd been party political, but I'm not. So I think what's fascinating, though, exactly as you said, Ian, is that Daniel's answer started with, but these people can obviously afford to pay, and that's a moot point. And then it moved into talking about teachers' terms and conditions and employees. I totally understand that. He's from a trade union. Only then do we get to what's going to happen to the students. And actually, that, I'm afraid, is very revealing, because the first question for any education secretary or anybody designing education policy should be, what's right for the students? What is going to give them the best possible education, which is the great life transformer? And then you work out, actually, what's the policy and the finances and everything else. So I'm less concerned about the actual policy itself. I'm more concerned about, what this says or doesn't say, because actually in this campaign, we have not heard enough about education from anybody.
No.
And we have certainly not heard enough from a wannabe Labour Education Secretary about schools. We hear a lot about childcare. We've heard a bit about tuition fees. But, we're not hearing anything about primary and secondary schools.
Daniel, what do you say to the idea that there are two types of independent, well, there are probably more than two, but the two types that I would suggest. You've got the big famous ones, the very wealthy ones, Eton, Harrow, Winchester, etc. They're going to be fine. I mean, they are probably going to survive this fight. But what about, I mean, I'm sure you've got some private schools in your patch that are not big, that are not rich, that have a lot of kids go from middle-class families, parents who scrimp and save, go without all of the normal things that a middle-class family would normally do, to make sure that their kids get the best education because they haven't got confidence in the local state schools. Now, you will naturally say, well, the state schools should be brought up to we'd all agree on that.
Yeah.
But it's at that level, I think, that where there are concerns that there will, I won't say be a mass exodus, but enough to make a difference to some local schools that they will find it difficult to cope.
Yeah, I mean, I have absolutely sympathy with those schools. Where I do agree with Nicky, actually, is that the VAT policy
and that's not a sentence that you thought you were going to say on this panel.
Where I do agree is the VAT policy has dominated the discussion throughout this election, rather than the broader issues facing education. I think maybe that's probably symptomatic of where newspaper editors and producers send their children to school, to be honest, because it does feature quite high. There is a huge issue in terms of education funding at the moment. 70% of schools have less funds in real terms than they did in 2010. We are only spending around 3.9% of GDP on education at the moment, where we used to spend in excess of 5% of GDP on education. We absolutely need to be talking about the funding crisis in the state sector.
But we need to talk about standards as well. It's not just about, if we only talk about everything in terms of funding, of course funding is very important. And believe me, I have sweated over Department for Education accounts. Sorry, stop tapping the table. But, because I can tell you how but it's about standards. It's about the opportunities that education brings for our young people to change their lives, to broaden their horizons, to nurture great characters so they don't go around placing bets on elections and all the rest of it. It's all of that, and that is not being talked about. And I think that is a tragedy, actually, for the young people and their parents in this country.
Can I just agree with you entirely, Nicky, that we haven't had any debate about what education is and what it's for. And I was actually speaking at a housing conference in Manchester this morning, and we were talking about green skills. And I said our schools have to stop being exam factories where pupils are forced through exam after exam, not taught the education for life, the preparation for life that they need. And where also has been the debate about the impact of schools on pupils' mental health, something I secured a debate in the House of Lords just before the House rose. And it was a very strong, very impassioned debate. Lots of parents and people from all sides of the House speaking about how this focus on exams, the way schools are working, the rigidity of discipline, all of these are huge issues that people are really concerned about what's happening with our education system. And where's the debate on this? We've seen no debate on this at all. I'm going to throw in the Green Party wants to abolish Ofsted and abolish SATs. Let's talk about that, because there hasn't been discussion of that at all, and there needs to be.
I'm happy to disagree with you on all of that, but I'm happy that we had if we were to have the debate.
Right. How many of us went to state schools on this panel? Daniel did? Nicky? You didn't? I did.
I got a scholarship, so that's why I didn't win.
And
it was selective. I don't know if that disqualifies it in some way, but it was state.
So I'm the only one. No, Daniel and I are the only ones that went to proper comps. What Alistair Campbell would refer to as bog standard comps. I'm never quite sure what that meant, but anyway. Right, more of your questions to come. It's 8:47.
This is LBC.
24.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:49. Daniel Kebede, Nicky Morgan, Natalie Bennett and Henry Hill taking your calls. Let's go to Sally in Stourbridge. Hello, Sally.
Hello. Another education question.
Oh, excellent.
I wonder what the panel think about the inordinate amount of children who are missing school, a huge number at the moment, and whether they think it's mainly to do with special educational needs, or is there something else, and what can we do about it?
Nicky, I mean, this has been a persistent problem in some ways, but it has got worse lately, hasn't it?
It's definitely got worse. It has been a persistent problem. I mean, I think I'm going to sound a bit sort of politician-y here, unsurprisingly, because it's actually quite a complex problem to solve. There are those families for whom actually the child, we're just talking about mental health in schools, there's a problem, there's an anxiety, there's an impossibility in getting the child through the door, there's unhappiness, there's bullying. There are some children for whom actually they're not getting the support from parents, and there isn't the sort of the education's important, you've got to go, and then I think one of the problems, and schools were almost locked down, I suppose, or shut down during COVID for very understandable reasons, but there are definitely some people who've got out of the habit of going, and therefore actually they just have not resumed that since COVID, and that's been one of the ongoing problems. And so I think for all those issues, unfortunately, there are different responses, and it's a massive issue. It's unfair to teachers because teaching children who are missing from class and then try to help them to catch up is incredibly difficult to do. It's obviously deeply, deeply harmful to the young person who, one hopes at some point in their lives will go, well, actually, I've missed an awful lot of my education. I've got to go back and do it again. But if you get out of that habit, it's very difficult to get them to pick it up again.
There are children who, during COVID, found that they learnt more at home than they did at school. My niece was one of them, and she just thrived in that environment.
So it's interesting, I was on the House of Lords COVID-19 Select Committee back in late 2020, 2021, and we did take evidence, and there were definitely some children, whether they had particular special educational needs, and so for whom the big school environment had been a deeply unhappy experience, or for other reasons, you're absolutely right, where actually being educated from home did work. The issue, of course, is what we don't know, is what the longer term issue is then around not socialising, not being part of a school environment, for example.
Natalie?
I think what we've got to measure is lots of schools are not being able to meet pupils' needs. I've done a lot of work with an organisation called Square Peg, and one of the things we've seen from the government, and I'm afraid also from the Labour opposition supporting, is a really punitive attitude towards parents. We're going to fine parents, we're going to force parents to get those children through the door. But if the child is deeply unhappy, is obviously ill, going to school makes them ill, what's the parent supposed to do? The parents have to try and do what's best for their child. And so, this is a question, as Daniel was saying earlier, a question of resources in schools, the support for pupils with special educational needs, etc. But it's also a question of the culture and whether the culture is right for pupils. And it's clearly just not working at the moment for very, very many pupils.
Henry?
So I think I don't know a vast amount about the definition of this, because we've mentioned pupils being educated at home. Now, as I understand it, you have a right to educate children at home, and lots of people are.
That is different from children who are absent.
And they're not counted as people who are missing, right?
Yeah.
So there we go. It's important to clarify that. I mean, it's one of those things where once you unlearn a habit, I think we mentioned this earlier. Once you unlearn that habit of getting up every day and going, actually, it is very hard, because what levers do you pull? I think I might agree with Jenny. There's only so much you can do when it comes to demonising parents. If it worked, I'd do it. But how much? It's hard. But schools can't.
Sorry, who's Jenny?
Natalie. Sorry.
These green peas, they're
all the same. Sorry. There's only so much you can do to force people back in, right? And so I actually don't know what the answer is, but it is incredibly. The long-term consequences are incredibly damaging, because if you underperform, especially in the early years at school, you can track crystal clearly the impact of that right the way down someone's life, in terms of income, in terms of likelihood to fall foul of the law, health outcomes, all kinds of measures. So it is incredibly important, but I'm failing in my job as an opinion columnist. I don't immediately have a glib solution.
You've done very well. Daniel?
So I think our children are having a really difficult time at the moment. We have got record numbers in poverty, 4.3 million children living in poverty, 1 million in destitution, so unable to have their basic needs met. That is a contributing factor, but there are a myriad of factors, I think, that are contributing to the crisis in attendance. Of course, the pandemic was incredibly disruptive. I'd be interested to know the age of your niece, Ian, because, yes, for some children who were having to do high-pressure, high-stakes exams, not being in school helped their mental health. However, we all recognise, I think, that COVID was an incredibly disruptive period for young people. So Kevin Collins put together a £15 billion COVID recovery plan that the government failed to implement. He resigned in protest. He's now going to be advising the Labour government should it be elected. Coming out of the pandemic, children's need in terms of SEN has risen significantly. There's been there's a crisis in mental health at the moment amongst our young people, driven by social media, high pressure in schools. It all constitutes, I think, it points to a huge failing, actually, from this current government over the last 14 years in terms of our children. And also, we have to recognise it as a crisis in engagement. So if young people aren't wanting to attend school, those in power need to really ask why.
OK. Aya in Romford says, Ian, I didn't realise you went to a normal school. I actually feel ashamed that as soon as I heard that, my perception of you changed a bit. More respect. A normal guy who's done well for himself. P.S. I think I just realised I have a bias. Well, self-knowledge is a wonderful thing, Aya, isn't it? Right, let's go to... we are going to Carl in Kidderminster. Hello, Carl.
Evening, Ian.
Hi, what would you like to say?
I can file a tax return online. I can admit to a speeding offence online. So why can't I vote online?
Henry.
Because the ballot box is an area where you can check if somebody's being coerced, if somebody's looking over their shoulder. And if you had online voting, the sad fact is that it would be possible to pressure a spouse or family member or somebody else, and you could make them vote. So, unfortunate and archaic as it is, and maybe there are ways that we can refine it, but ultimately that curtain, that box, that place in an official site is the way that we guarantee the secret ballot, and that's really important.
What about postal votes?
Yeah, I mean, I would massively curtail postal votes, to be honest. I think that they were originally introduced for special circumstances, and now they've been rolled out left, right, and centre. But they are in fact subject to exactly the same concerns, which is why I wouldn't issue nearly so many.
Natalie?
Well, I think we were talking about trust in politics before, and I think there's a big problem with trust in politics, and people would have great concerns about the results. You know, it would be very hard to do that in a transparent way. But, you know, what my bigger concern is why we have voter ID, which is voter suppression straight out of the US far-right playbook, that's going to affect this election, that lots of people who will go down to the polling station, or indeed will not go down to the polling station because they haven't got the right ID, and they won't be able to vote. And that's an absolute denial of our democracy that's happening right now.
Nicky?
Well, I don't agree with that last point, and I think actually having ID to vote is a perfectly reasonable request in the 21st century. I think probably eventually we may well get to a state of having some kind of voting online, and there are countries around the world that do it. But I think one of the things we've seen is the, as we've seen from cyber crime, cyber attacks, we now have to, if we were going to do that, we would have to make sure that the voting was incredibly secure, because the opportunities for a hostile state or other actor to hack in and destroy even more confidence in who'd won the election would be an incredibly risky thing to do.
Daniel, briefly.
So I've already voted in this general election.
Me too.
Yeah, because, absolutely.
Natalie and I can't vote.
Sending off that postal...
Quite right, too.
Sending off that postal vote really helped me participate in the democracy. I have no idea where I'll be on the general election day. I think we should be absolutely minimising people's barriers to participate in democracy, whether it's in government or indeed in trade unions. We still are subject to postal voting when that could easily be online.
Right, a fun question from Danielle in Hull. For those of us off to Glastonbury for the first time tomorrow, what is your number one camping tip? Mine would be don't go. Natalie?
Well, I would recommend a storm kettle, which is a great way in which you can produce hot water and a nice cuppa in that morning after, when you really need a nice cuppa, from just a few bits of cardboard and a bit of paper, and you don't need any special fire lighting skills.
Daniel?
Baby wipes. Take baby wipes. Honestly.
Why?
Because you will definitely feel grubby at these festivals.
Don't give them too much detail.
Take baby wipes with you.
Henry?
For festival camping, heat proof. You can buy these foil sheets that are fall on one side, like the ones you get for the inside of cars. You put them over your tent. It means that when you come back after a hard day of dancing, your tent hasn't been absorbing the sun all day. It's an absolute godsend. It will change festivals for you forever.
Nicky?
Get a day pass and then book a nearby B&B.
Have any of you been to Glastonbury?
Nope.
Not Glastonbury, no.
Oh, you have?
I went there as a speaker, not as a participant.
No, that doesn't
Garden Party Lost Village.
Thank you very much indeed to all four of you for joining us today. Tomorrow's panel includes the comedian Jeff Norcott, the political journalist Zoe Grunewald of the website The Lead, the former Conservative MP and Middle East Minister Alistair Burt, and the national chair of the Labour Muslim Network, Ali Milani. So do join us 8 o'clock again tomorrow night. If you ever miss an episode of Cross Question, you can catch up on Global Player or the LBC YouTube channel. Now, let's change the subject. After 9, we're going to be talking about conversion therapy, because Labour have said that they will ban it for good. Now, the Conservative Party has had a policy of doing exactly the same thing, but it's never actually happened. The consultations have continued.